Alright, welcome back. Today we're going to look at Unit 3. And what's interesting about Unit 3, exit out of psychology there, what's interesting about Unit 3 is that this is a gigantic unit. So it's a time period for Unit 3 that extends from the year 500 all the way to 1500. So you are talking about a long time period. So there are going to be many chapters that make up this unit, and I'm going to help to maybe explain this and split it up for you so you can kind of wrap your head around it. And then we'll begin talking about Chapter 8 next time, although there's some of Chapter 8 in this as well, and Chapter 9 and 8 and 9 will be tested upon. So you see that at the beginning here. 8 is commerce and culture, and then you see China and the world, East Asian connection. And it's the same time period, 500 to 1500 generally, but 8 and 9 are very connected because China in the world is all about China and trade and China's influence. And in Asia, certainly, the country for most of this time period for Unit 3, the country or location or empire that's the most influential in the world is China. Now that's going to change as we go through the semester. Europe, we'll look at Christendom in Europe, connected and divided, which means that there's going to be a split in the church. The Byzantine Empire will rise, and we'll see this city that was Byzantium, a dusty outpost of really nothing, that Constantine, the Emperor of Rome, will build a city with his name, Constantinople, which will be the Eastern Orthodox Catholic Church, which will rise from there. There's really only one Christian church, it's Catholic Church at this time. And then from there, Constantinople in 1453 is sacked by the Turks, and then they see an influence of, and I'm doing this because it kind of moves to the north, an influence of that city of Constantinople, the Christianity of it anyway, flowing up through to Russia, which becomes, in some ways, the third Rome, is what they think of it as. So that chapter 10 can be pretty complicated. Chapter 10 also deals with it's not just Christianity, as none of these chapters are just what they say they are. They're going to look at just about every place in the world at that time period. But Christianity as it relates to the different religions of the time, how it compares, but also we'll be discussing feudalism and what that means during this Dark Ages time period during Europe's time. And really what's interesting is chapter 11, the worlds of Islam. We have a really golden age for Islam, while they say this is a dark or medieval time period for Europe. To say that this is the Dark Ages is definitely, in my opinion, Eurocentric, because it's not dark for everyone. Certainly not dark ages for the learning and creativity and science that's happening in the Islamic world. So we'll look at the worlds of Islam, very distinctive and different compared to the rest of the world at this time period. And they build this tremendous empire that's really the middlemen of trade between Asia and Europe. And Islam becomes this synonymous term for not only the religion of the people of the area of North Africa and into what we call the Middle East and into Asia, it's also the government entity and the cultural base, and it's so closely tied and woven together into the fabric of their society that we call it the Islamic world, not just because of that religious connection, but it's really a cultural connection. Then chapter 12 kind of sits on its own in green there. It is definitely isolated for a reason. We've got the Mongols and what they call the Mongol moment, which for a moment, at least in terms of world history's time period, if you're looking at it, is pretty impactful moment. The connection and the opening of the trade routes that the Mongols do, they kind of pave the way for a lot of changes, including some of the worst changes, because now you have a pathway of trade that opens after their invasions and conquering people along the Silk Roads especially, and into northern Africa and the Middle East and into Russia, you have an opening up that happens that allows disease to spread pretty easily from east to west, from Asia into Europe. And what you see happen is so many people die and perish from the Black Death or bubonic plague. And there were 3 or 4 different versions of them, one of them being the absolute worst. And we'll talk more about that, and it's really in each of these chapters that it's mentioned. And you'll see a lot of this overlap in each one of the chapters. Strayer is trying to focus on an area and theme it, but he's also comparing it to all these other places at the same time. Worlds of the 15th century is really this last gasp look at the world before it's connected, and before it's connected in a way where people are trading and influencing each other. That's pre-Columbian. And when we say pre-Columbian, we mean pre-Columbus. So 1492. That's when Columbus came to America. So 1493 was quite a year too, because now things really start to change. We'll focus in on that. The last test of this unit will be those 2 chapters kind of combined. So let's look at a couple other things here. How should we categorize or try to make sense of the millennium that stretches from the end of the classical era to the beginning of the modern world history? Remember, classical era was 500 BCE to 500 CE, so that millennium. And now we have a new one, 500 to 1500. And at the top picture there, you see the depiction of the fall of Rome, and at the bottom, the depiction of Columbus's landing in the New World. So the beginning of the time period, around 200 to 1850, many classical states and civilizations are disruptive, declined, and start to collapse. The end of the time period is Columbus's transatlantic voyages, and around 1500 you start to see this new departure in world history for most people, a connection made between Afro-Eurasia and the Americas that has lasting consequences in so many ways. So let's look at this picture here real quickly. It's very interesting. You see the Pope figure who's standing on the steps. You see people that seem to be hurt. This child's bloodied. You see who looks like maybe Alaric or one of these invaders. Of course, he's on a black horse. There's lots of smoke in the distance, and this is ancient Rome as it's being kind of torn apart by invaders. Often these invaders are dark-skinned, so I think that's interesting too. There's a slant to this, isn't there, in terms of the goodness and innocence of the pure white, paled skin Italian or early Romans before they were Italian on the Italian peninsula here, and the just shocking destruction of what Rome was. Although there was a date and a time period where Rome was sacked, and then Rome was sacked again and sacked again, there's really a slow, gradual change that happens. It's not like Rome is this incredible Roman Empire one day, and the next day they're sacked and they fall. The Roman Empire, lasts for a long time. And around 500 is when these things start to fall apart. But I want to remind you that the Western Roman Empire may be gone, but the Eastern Roman Empire lives on, and that's under the auspices of Constantine and the Eastern Orthodox Church, which relocates there. So don't think that the Roman Empire is completely gone just yet. We'll see that in chapter 10. So here is Christopher Columbus, how it looked exactly. Now, no way it looked like this, because first of all, there's great evidence that his ships were in terrible condition, that the natives helped him to be able to land and then come ashore and repaired his ship. So he didn't repay them very well. He took some of them by force back to Europe, and I think about a third of the natives that he took back with him died. And upon his return, the Europeans began to treat the native people with great amounts of disrespect. I guess you could say if cutting off ears and that sort of thing was disrespectful. We'll talk more about that down the road as well. Third wave civilizations is what Strayer calls this time period, instead of calling it something like post-classical or medieval or Eurocentric. Or I'm sorry, that is Eurocentric. And I think it's Eurocentric just because what is post-classical anyway? Is post-classical just this idea that the classical period is over? It was so important and so great, so now the next time period should just not even have its own unique name, but you'll just call it post the last thing because that was so awesome. To me, it smacks of Eurocentric thought, which is the focusing on European culture or history to the exclusion of a wider view or global view of the world, implicitly regarding Europe's culture as preeminent or more important. So by calling it the third wave of development of civilization, I think Strayer is making a case that it's waves of differences within civilizations. The first wave being first civilizations, which most people can agree with. He calls the classical age really a second development or second wave of civilization. And then the third wave of development is this post-classical time period. In a lot of ways, it makes more sense to me as well. Just threw this in here just for you to think about, but this is the upside down world map. And some teachers have this on their wall in their classroom to kind of remind us that our point of view is important. There's no reason why this could not be the map that was on our walls. And why do we look at the United States of America being the way that it is? North and South could be switched. It doesn't have to be the way that it is. I mean, we think of North and we think of South as being what they are because that's just what it has been labeled. But in reality, it's not like that really at all, is it? I mean, the globe is a spheroid, traveling through space, and we've marked it and put our human imprint upon it. Is it any wonder that the globes that we look at don't have the Pacific Ocean down the center? Although that would seem to make some sense because there's maybe more connective tissue here, if you will. The continents are kind of touching right here and coming together. But instead, what we see is typically a European slant, where this marks the middle of the map, where Europe is. It's an interesting thing to think about. And it's interesting here to look at how big Alaska looks and how different it is, and how Mexico's on top of the United States. So Australia seems to have a prominent role here too. I think that's pretty interesting. Anyway, it's ties that bind the trans-regional interaction of this post-classical period, and you see here the three major areas that we'll be looking at, minus South America, and also, there is some of the Indian Ocean trade there at the top with the blue lines, just looking at ocean travel. And you've got the Silk Road in the red at the top in the map, but the sand roads that you see from West Africa, really important with the products like salt, Islam, which is a product in some ways, the cultural ideas moving there, and they have a great impact. Gold, of course, silk, ceramics, ivory, wood, and of course slaves. But these are silk roads, sand roads, sea roads, and American roads. And you could call the American roads really more American webs, not much globes, and we'll look at that in just a second. Increasingly, a change was caused by the contact with strangers and or their ideas, their armies, their goods, their diseases. A cosmopolitan mix of many globalizations started to occur in certain places where you would see a mixing of cultures. Even today here in what's known as Somalia, north or south of Somalia, you'll see Indian spices in their food and a flavoring that has the distinctive type of Indian flavoring to it, and you'd think, well, how is that possible? Well, for so many years there's been trade between these two coasts. So ties that bind, regional or trans-regional interactions. You've got the population in millions. This is a graphic that I think you should definitely focus on for the test. It looks at the change of population in millions of people. When we get to the end of this time period, just look where the Americas is. It's not even to 50 million people at all. I mean, it's just about to skim that. The world's population is 400 million people more than that, and Afro-Eurasia is making up all of that, just about all of that. So I just want to keep you in perspective here and make sure you understand the perspective of the fact that these major trade routes of Afro-Eurasia are entirely important. And it's not just that there's a Afro-Eurasian centric nature to Strayer, it's that that's where the people are at this time period. So it's something to keep in mind. The Eastern Hemisphere developed a long-distance trade much more extensively than their Western neighbors do. And Strayer calls the Americans, their trading system is more of a web of trade. And I think you could say that's less developed. And just like if you blew like that into a spider web, it would at least wobble or maybe break apart. It's not very strong. But these very strong roads or connections or routes, it's not really a road as much as we think of it as a road, but it's more trade routes, mostly over land and sea and sometimes sand. So in the Americas, how was it different? Well, you can see the web type structure here, the western United States, and the stars being rendezvous or seasonal areas, the squares being indicative of permanent trade settlements, which there aren't very many. Looking at it really quickly, 1, 2, 3, 4, 5, 6, and that's it. The circles are little temporary spots, which you'll see a few of those as well. And what did they trade? Turquoise, obsidian, these prestige points, which were probably used for cutting or other possible things, like little knives or weapons. But mica from the northwest, and then you've got the parrot feathers from Mexico. All those things used in trade. I really want to emphasize to you, and we'll probably see one of these in class, the Silk Road and Ancient Trade from Crash Course. Really a good one. There are 3 Crash Course videos for this chapter, and I think they're all very insightful and important. And really they're the 3 Afro-Eurasian trade routes that get mentioned and discussed. But what's the impact of long-distance trade? I want you to write that down in your notes. Write out the ways in which people and regions can be affected directly or indirectly by commerce, trading. What ways can people be impacted? So, kind of pause the video, write that up, and once you're finished writing down the ways that you can think of that trade impacts or affects them, then come right back to me and we'll look at the next part. Okay, so what did you write down? Let's think about it and see it from another perspective here. What was traded in the long-distance trade of the pre-modern world? You've got, in 2011, the average distance that a food item has traveled to reach an American plate is 1,000 miles. That's pretty amazing. It's about 3,000 miles from New York to San Francisco. It's amazing that we get food that travels that far. Massive quantities of trade that occurred today were not happening in any way during this time period. Mostly they ate local. But wine was transported in barrels or pottery vessels, and usually by ship because of the weight. Beer couldn't have been transported long distances because it would spoil after a few days on the road, especially with that refrigeration. Wheat was occasionally profitable to ship, but only by sea, and if you consider if it gets wet at all, it's going to rot or spoil. Horses and cattle, I'll leave you to imagine the difficulty here, but putting them on a ship. Porcelain, what's the problem there? They could easily break. And spices and silk, these things could be traded, but you have to be careful with that. And spices and silk, definitely going to make the trip, and definitely going to make it. So let's look at silk and sand roads. They're kind of connected, these Eurasian routes. In many ways similar. They're both over large distances of land. And how heavy a load could a horse carry? Well, what about a camel? What about a donkey? What about just a human huffing along here and just making the trip by foot? A common measure is that a reasonable load for one man to transport on foot is about 50 pounds. And I think to myself, 50 pounds that you're carrying across a continent, it seems like a lot. But don't consider the fact that people walk from China to Europe and from Europe to China, from North Africa, to the ships that awaited them in the ports of North Africa. That's not what happened. They would trade along these, different trading centers, and so it was more local than you would think it is. But on a good road, how heavy or heavily laden could a cart be that a horse could pull? And is the same energy compared to one man's power to move things around. You've got 500 pounds on a wheel or wheels on a road and 5,000 on rails. So you get rails moving, that's a whole different thing. 50,000 pounds on water. So that's why the sea trade is so important, because you can move things in bulk so much easier and so much cheaper. To the silk and sand roads of the Americas, you see down there at the bottom, you've got the llama here, and look, there's 4 llama sitting there. And you've got some of these long distance roads that were pretty well maintained. The Roman roads up here at the top, they were well known for their rock and cement like roads. And then you've got the caravans on what looks like to be some camels, and could be just about any kind of animal. Sometimes oxen would carry some things, but there was still this Roman system of roads. Even though the Romans were gone, the roads were outlasting them. The Andean roads had been established with the protective walls and bridges, and many other communities provided some sort of paved roads and bridges. But for interstate commerce, what we're talking about is routes, and these are unpaved and undeveloped, in which a traveler needed to hire a guide or follow traces left by earlier travelers just to make their way along. It's not like they had GPS then. Wheeled carts could not travel on most of these long distance routes. What was needed were pack animals or human bearers, and pack animals in the Americas were non-existent, except for the llama. It's the only one. So keep that in mind. Let's look at weather patterns, and I'll remind you, if you need to write this stuff down, just rewind the video and pause it and write it down. But weather patterns in the Indian Ocean facilitated trade between Southeast Asia and Africa, making the journey from Africa to the Indian coast much easier in the summer months. And you can kind of see it here from April to September. From Africa to the Indian coast, you're going to make that trip much easier to make. And then in the fall to early spring, when you move from India down here to Madagascar, you've got those monsoon winds behind you. So all of these trade routes here were affected by those winds, not just the India to Africa ones, but I'm sure there were strong winds across the Indian Ocean as well. The Great Zimbabwe is a very powerful state, and you can see it here in white and yellow in the center, that emerged from growing trade in gold to the East African coast, and then that is of course shipped then to India. I really want to remind you of the Bantu people and how they spread. We know this because of their language and how it has changed or survived over time, but they've kind of spread, and there's great evidence of them being a conduit of trade, the Bantu speaking peoples, as they moved through Africa and traded. A lot of the goods that they were in possession of came through the Great Zimbabwe trading areas of southeast part of Africa. So that's a quick look here at introducing the units that we're talking about. 8-9 is where we're at today. I'll come back and do another video on chapter 8 in a day or so here, and then we'll also be looking at chapter 9 pretty quickly, and the quiz for that will be coming up before you know it. But the first test is on chapters 8 and 9. We'll have a second test on 10 and 11, and a third test to end the semester on 12 and 13. So be thinking of it kind of in those terms. and we'll probably have a couple more FRQs to write in class. So keep your thinking caps going here. Until next time, don't forget to be awesome.